afternoon, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and Council members. Heidi Hansen, Economic Vitality Director. Today I'm here with several city staff to talk to you about our local recovery plan. I wanted to point out that we currently have an ongoing campaign called Visit, Discover, Grow. The idea of this campaign is to show that getting people to visit our city, discover our attractions, amenities, and more, in turn gets them to grow their business or set up residence here. This is true with the example of W.L. Gore and Associates. Bill Gore came here 60 years ago for a visit and decided to make Flagstaff a place to do business. They are now one of our top 20 employers. Like the mayor has said, we love Flagstaff and we are getting through this uncertain time together. This mighty team on the phone today will be going over a variety of topics ranging from government relief for our businesses to our marketing plan to help rebound our community, which is targeted to our locals and our visitors. I will now turn the time over to Jack Fitchett, one of our management analysts from the city of Flagstaff. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi, and good afternoon, Mayor and Council. This is Jack Fitchett, management analyst to the CMO. So just to dive in on this overview slide, so Sarah Langley and I will be giving a quick update on recent state and federal legislation. Then we'll pass it over to Stacy BK, who will cover some of the grants that we've been monitoring and applying for. And then we'll end with covering some additional legislation that we can expect on the horizon. So I'll kick us off and give you a brief overview of some of the state legislation that passed in March that is related to COVID-19 relief funding. You'll see on the slide two bills, SB 1690, which is known as the Crisis Contingency and Safety Net Fund, and has also been referred to by some as a governor initiative fund. These monies can be used for a variety of items that you see listed below. While these funds do not directly benefit the city of Flagstaff, they do benefit our partners like Flagstaff Shelter Services and our local food banks. SB 1051, which is known as the Public Health Emergency Fund, is $55 million that was appropriated from the state's Budget Stabilization Fund. This is being used to pay for expenses related to the COVID-19 health emergency. The majority of these funds have been used to pay for medical supplies and lab equipment. And additionally, you'll see below some of the distributions to some of our local agencies. So again, these are not necessarily benefiting the city of Flagstaff directly, but they do benefit our county partners and local agencies that are assisting us during this pandemic. I'll also mention that the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, or the JLBC for short, is tracking where these dollars are going and is making regular updates on their website so the public and all of us can track the usage of these funds. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Sarah, who will take you through some of the recent federal legislation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council members. Sarah Langley, Management Analyst. As Jack mentioned, I'll give a brief overview of federal release resources that could benefit both individuals and businesses here in Flagstaff and help with our local recovery. I won't go into a lot of detail, but everything I discuss is on our website. So one of the first major pieces of legislation signed was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, also known as the FFCRA. This legislation benefits both employees and employers, in that it requires small businesses to offer additional paid sick leave and emergency FMLA, but also offers a tax credit to offset that additional cost. So another major piece of legislation signed was the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, otherwise known as the CARES Act. So this totaled $2.2 trillion, which makes it the largest stimulus bill in our history. And a rough outline of how that funding is distributed is shown here on the slide. Please note that these numbers don't quite add up because there are some smaller pots of money that are not listed here. Notably, the CARES Act sets aside $340 billion for state and local governments, and within that is the $150 billion State and Local Stabilization Fund, and we will touch on that later in the presentation. The CARES Act contains numerous resources for both businesses and individuals here in Flagstaff. For businesses, in addition to nonprofits, two main programs have emerged. You've probably heard of the Paycheck Protection Program. So this program allows small businesses and nonprofits access to forgivable loans if they keep their employees on their payroll or they hire their employees back by a certain date. Unfortunately, this program has exhausted its appropriated funding, but Senate has passed a bill with new funding, and the House is actually voting on this as we speak. So we expect new funding for this program to be signed by the President either tonight or tomorrow. The deal includes an additional $310 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, and also includes a $60 billion set aside within that for underbanked businesses. The second major program is the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. This is an existing loan scheme from the Small Business Administration and offers working capital to both businesses and nonprofits. Unfortunately, this program is also run out of money, which proves the popularity of both of these programs. But the bill that Congress is passing right now also includes $60 billion in additional funding for the EIDL. So other programs also exist in addition to these two kind of main programs. Other programs include the Main Street Lending Facility, the Employee Retention Credit, delayed payroll tax deadlines, and industry-specific loans and grants. I would like to note that there have definitely been a lot of problems rolling out these programs from the federal level, but we hope that those problems are being fixed in time, and all of these programs are designed to offer kind of a broad mix of support to businesses. The CARES Act also benefits individuals in various ways. So it expands unemployment insurance and increases the weekly benefit amount. It gives a $1,200 direct cash payment to eligible taxpayers. It implements protections against evictions and foreclosures on federally backed mortgages, although it's important to note that all payments will eventually be due in the future. And it temporarily suspends federal student loan payments. So I know this was a lot of information, and we went over a lot of different resources that were created both by state and federal legislation. So all of these resources and more are featured on the city's website. And the picture on the slide shows how you can access those resources from the city's homepage. So those should be there if you need further information. Thank you, and I'll now pass it over to Stacy BK to talk about specific grants created by the CARES Act.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm Stacy Brooklyn-Eggs. I'm the Grants Contracts Manager and also your Disaster Recovery Manager. I'd like to take a quick moment, though, to thank our COVID task force team. You heard the names. Rick Tatter mentioned them. Been very hard at work trying to track this funding and heavily involved in webinars and doing everything we can for our community to track these funds. A lot of these funds, some of them will go direct to the state and pass through to local governments, and some will come directly to us as a local government. So under the Public Health and Safety, the FEMA Disaster Relief Funds, that is your public assistance. That's your Stafford Act, which is typically used in disasters, similar to what we did in the museum fire. This fund was used in other prior disasters. This has been set aside specifically for emergency protective measures, and we are tracking costs now, and we're at about $400,000 in expenses to date for the city of Flagstaff, and we'll continue to track and get reimbursed for those costs. The next one is through FEMA, Assistance to Firefighters for PPE, which is personal protective equipment. And that application should be coming out any day, and we will be applying for that with the fire department. Next is the FEMA Emergency Management Performance. That is for emergency preparedness. The state received $2 million through this fund, and hopefully will work with local governments with us to pass through some of that funding. Next is the FEMA Emergency Food Shelter Program, and those funds are set aside for social service organizations and nonprofits and governments, and we will be looking towards that fund and working with housing to see if we can apply for those. This is a direct grant through Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. It's Emergency Supplemental Burn Grant. We applied and within a week received the $65,915. And that is covering personal protective equipment that has been purchased through the police department and fire department, and that's going to cover a lot of our expenses for PPE that we've already spent and for future PPEs. The next grants are through Health and Human Services. these funds are through going to the state, and most likely you will be seeing those go to the county health services passed through by the state. And then lastly on this slide is Federal Communications Commission. They received $100 million in this fund, and this is for rural health care. Social Services and Housing and Community Development. This fund received $3.5 billion and is to stabilize child care providers. The next one is Community Service Block Grants, and this is received $1 billion in that fund source, and that is to lessen poverty in communities. And we hope, again, some of these that will go to the state will pass through to local governments, and we will be applying for them. Low-income housing energy assistance received $900 million. Again, that will probably go to the state, those funds, and then pass through. Emergency Solutions Grant Program, homeless assistance is this is for, and they receive $4 billion, and we will be working heavily with housing, and they may talk about it later in the budget retreat about some of the sources that they're researching and going for. The next one is Housing and Urban Development, tenant-based. This is for rental assistance, and they received $1.25 billion, and so we'll go for those. The next one is HUD Community Development Block Grant. This is their COVID fund, and we have received our allocation, and that is $359,604. And again, housing is on this with our task force, and we will be applying and receiving those funds. The next two, Eliza will talk about later in her presentation, and this recovery plan. But these are direct grants to art agencies, and they receive $75 million in this fund. Economic and workforce development infrastructure and small business. Sarah touched a lot about that, and again, the EV team will be talking more about small business assistance. The EDA Economic Assistance Grant. This is $1.5 billion in this fund, and it's for disaster relief and infrastructure. And this disaster relief fund, just a little bit about Economic Development Administration. This fund actually funded.
Stacey, I think that there's a question by Councilmember Wheeling.
Thank you. Thanks for stopping me.
Thank you, Stacey. Quick question. I know there's been some stipulation on cities of $500,000 to get certain funding. So if you run across those as you're speaking, would you just mention that these are above, or that rule affects those grants?
I think I understand your question. Yes, those are separate than these funding sources. Those state and local funds, Jack kind of touched on those. Those are above and beyond these funding sources that I'm referencing.
Okay, so the ones that you are referencing are absolutely the ones that we can go after.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay,
correct.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. So next is the Economic Development Administration. We talked a little bit about this disaster relief fund. Actually funded the Business Accelerator. We actually received $4 million in disaster relief fund from prior disasters. So they've been given $1.5 billion, and so additional funds for disaster relief and infrastructure. So this is a great opportunity. We've actually used some of the infrastructure funds out at the airport, at the air park, to do water and sewer. So these are very viable funds for the city to go for. The next is Federal Transit Administration and Supplemental Public Transit Apportionments and Allocations. This is to main transit services. We've been in discussions with MetroPlan and NAPTA about these funds. And I just received an email right before we jumped on the call here that ADOT submitted a $35.7 million application for rural transit for these out of the $25 billion. Next is the Small Business Administration grants, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I know the EV team will be talking a little bit more about that. And then the last one is very exciting. As you know, we received an allocation of a little over $18 million in airport grants, and those that's already been reached out to us to begin the application process. They have provided 3 options of those funds. One is operating, which is payroll, debt service, utility service, supplies, that we could use them for that. Option 2 for development, which is your capital development project. And option 3 could be a combo of operating and development. We will be meeting next week with the city manager and a task force team to talk about the spending plan. And then we'll work with council and bring that back. And Heidi had mentioned to me earlier that maybe this would be something that you may want to put in the parking lot to talk about the details of this $18 million. And with that ends my presentation. Thank you.
So as Sarah previously mentioned, the State and Local Stabilization Fund was $150 billion that was appropriated within the CARES Act that is going to be sent to states and municipalities to help pay for COVID-19 related expenses. To jump back to Councilmember Whalen's question about the population cap, this is one of those funds where if you were a municipality or a county that was greater than 500,000 folks, then you could apply directly for these monies from the federal treasury, where if you are less than 500,000 like we are, our money will be sent to the state, and then we will apply through the state with the governor's office to receive those funds. So I hope that clears that up a little bit. Yesterday afternoon, the federal treasury released guidelines for how these funds can be used, and we are still working through that document as I received confirmation about an hour ago on what we can use these funds for. Unfortunately, revenue shortfalls was specifically called out in this document and is not an acceptable use for these funds. However, Sarah and I will continue to advocate for the use of these funds to be used for revenue losses in future legislation, and Sarah will touch on that here briefly. Diving a little bit more into the numbers, Arizona is expected to receive approximately $2.82 billion from the federal treasury. And again, that will be going to the governor, and we will be working with their office to receive those funds. They have not released a framework or any real guidance on how to apply for those funds yet, but we're expecting to see that hopefully early next week once the federal treasury releases all of those funds, and we'll be watching closely to ensure that we can apply for the city of Flagstaff's distribution as soon as possible once that information is made. And I'll turn it over to Sarah for the last portion of this presentation.
Just wanted to provide a quick update on the Phase 4 coronavirus stimulus package. You may have heard of this package kind of looming in the future. It is anticipated to be similar in size or larger than the CARES Act. So it's definitely a substantial piece of legislation. We're keeping an eye on this, and we're hoping to see something passed by late May. It's kind of what everyone is anticipating right now. This could include additional funding as well as increased flexibilities for the State and Local Stabilization Fund that Jack spoke to. In addition, it could also include significant funding for infrastructure projects. So city staff are already busy creating a list of shovel-ready, job-creating projects that could benefit from this legislation and would also help to further council goals as well as aid in Flagstaff's local recovery.